You can dedicate an entire lifetime to someone, give time, money, love, sacrifice your dreams, erase your own desires and still be discarded as if you were nothing. That was exactly what happened to Brenda. After years of being a single mother, raising 2 children on her own, she was rewarded with a public humiliation that rewrote her story forever. The scene? An elegant baby shower, full of fake smiles and words sharp as blades. Her daughter, Cassie, praised her mother-in-law as if she were the only woman worthy of applause, completely ignoring the mother who had raised her. But what no one expected was that Brenda would not stay silent and, even less, bow her head. What happened the next day proved that some mothers don't cry, they transform. This is the story of a woman betrayed, humiliated, and rejected who chose the most powerful revenge, calculated silence. And just when you think it's all over, that's when the true awakening begins. Brenda had always been the type to swallow her tears. She preferred silence rather than leaving room for others' pity. But that afternoon, in that vineyard decorated with pink balloons and rehearsed smiles, something inside her snapped. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a tear. It was silence. A dense silence, heavy with a weight only those who have been invisible inside their own story can understand. The words left her daughter's lips like poison served in a crystal glass. Patricia is my true mother. The world didn't stop, no one shouted, but inside Brenda, a heart closed and turned to stone. Not from hatred, but from exhaustion. In that second, she didn't just lose a daughter. She lost herself. And she found another version of herself she never imagined existed, cold, lucid, unyielding. You can dedicate an entire lifetime to someone, give time, money, love, sacrifice your dreams, erase your own desires and still be discarded as if you were nothing. That was exactly what happened to Brenda. After years of being a single mother, raising 2 children on her own, she was rewarded with a public humiliation that rewrote her story forever. The scene? An elegant baby shower, full of fake smiles and words sharp as blades. Her daughter, Cassie, praised her mother-in-law as if she were the only woman worthy of applause, completely ignoring the mother who had raised her. But what no one expected was that Brenda would not stay silent and, even less, bow her head. What happened the next day proved that some mothers don't cry, they transform. This is the story of a woman betrayed, humiliated, and rejected who chose the most powerful revenge, calculated silence. And just when you think it's all over, that's when the true awakening begins. Brenda had always been the type to swallow her tears. She preferred silence rather than leaving room for others' pity. But that afternoon, in that vineyard decorated with pink balloons and rehearsed smiles, something inside her snapped. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a tear. It was silence. A dense silence, heavy with a weight only those who have been invisible inside their own story can understand. The words left her daughter's lips like poison served in a crystal glass. Patricia is my true mother. The world didn't stop, no one shouted, but inside Brenda, a heart closed and turned to stone. Not from hatred, but from exhaustion. In that second, she didn't just lose a daughter. She lost herself. And she found another version of herself she never imagined existed, cold, lucid, unyielding. When we talk about betrayal, most people think of marriage. But there are pains far deeper. To be betrayed by a son or daughter is to be rejected at the core of existence. Brenda hadn't built expectations, she had built lives. And it was in that construction that she set aside her own foundations. While her children grew, she withered day after day, smile after smile. All she ever asked for was respect. But respect, when not cultivated early, becomes a luxury. And those never taught to recognize sacrifice learn to despise it. Cassie's words were only the last nail in a coffin Brenda had been hammering for years, ingratitude upon ingratitude. Her memory wasn't selective. It was relentless. And each detail of those decades now weighed like evidence in an inner courtroom. You know when you replay your life in slow motion? Brenda did that without closing her eyes. She saw the meals she skipped to pay for uniforms. The sleepless nights waiting for her children to return. The times she was humiliated but held firm so no one would worry. All of it came back like a silent tsunami. And then she understood the problem wasn't just Cassie. It was the logic she herself had helped build. Servitude disguised as motherhood. Love without limits, without return, without reciprocity. It's like giving everything and still being blamed for not giving more. Brenda's coldness wasn't born from nowhere, it had been carved by years of emotional neglect. And now, with the right trigger, it became a shield. And those who have lived with a heart raw and bleeding know that coldness, sometimes, is a form of liberation. There was no scandal. No scene. Brenda simply smiled. But it wasn't a sweet smile, it was the kind that precedes a storm. A warning. She knew poetic justice doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes, it comes in the form of distance. And that's what she chose: distance. Not physical, but emotional. An abyss no apology could ever cross. There, at that celebration where everyone seemed happy, she mourned. And it was the mourning of a mother who had died to that daughter. The irony? No one noticed. Everyone kept drinking, laughing, taking pictures. Except her. Brenda simply existed with a distant gaze and a decided mind. That woman would never be the same again. If you've been through it, you know the pain of being discarded by the one you loved most is not easy to explain. But there comes a point when pain runs out. And what remains is clarity. Brenda never cried again after that day. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it no longer made sense to waste a tear on someone who despised her sweat. Rejection is a cruel word, but sometimes it's all we need to wake up. And it was that awakening that turned the key. Brenda stopped being accessible. She stopped trying to understand. She stopped waiting. And that was her silent revenge, the definitive cut. Not with anger, but with lucidity. A heart of stone, yes, but marked with wounds only those who have lived it understand. And now, she was finally ready to turn the page. That's why, if you still believe forgiveness is always necessary, maybe you need to hear the other side of the story. Because there are forgivenesses that feed abusive cycles. There are reconciliations that don't free, they only rewrite pain with new words. Brenda understood this late, but in time. And when she decided to walk away, it wasn't out of pride. It was survival instinct. Have you ever tried to survive someone who kills you from the inside little by little? She tried for 30 years. There comes a moment when even the soul says enough. From then on, everything Brenda did had a single goal: to restore her own worth. Not with speeches. With attitude. With rupture. With consequence. Maybe you think it's an exaggeration. But try living an entire life for someone and being discarded in front of strangers. It's easy to judge when you don't know the weight. Brenda didn't seek revenge. She sought justice, and that difference changes everything. There was no more space for explanations, excuses, or empty reconciliations. What remained was a determined woman, rewriting her own memory with cold blood and purpose. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be reframed. And that's what she began to do right there, at that event that should have been about love, but became a stage of ingratitude and humiliation. So if you've made it this far, you've realized this story is not about drama. It's about liberation. And if any part of you has ever felt you loved more than you were loved, gave more than you received, gave everything and got crumbs, stay. Because what comes next is the continuation of this transformation. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and follow this journey. Because sometimes, what looks like the end is just the beginning of independence. Deer Creek was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower. Houses with wooden porches, streets without hurry, neighbors who still waved from afar. It was there, on a nearly forgotten corner of Missouri, that Brenda had decided to stay after her children took their own paths. The house was modest, with peeling paint and furniture that had seen better days, but it carried a soul only those who lived intensely could understand. It was in that silent place she woke up every day, drank her coffee alone, and listened to the sound of her own thoughts. There was no luxury, nor frequent visits. But there was peace, at least, until the memories began to scream. Because too much silence also speaks. On the living room shelf, old picture frames still rested. Cassie, at 4 years old, hugging a stuffed bunny. Michael, at graduation, with a proud smile. Photos that once were a source of pride now seemed like small trophies of a competition Brenda felt she had lost. Motherhood, for her, wasn't a soap opera romance. It was battle. And every corner of that house was a memory: the scratched floor from the bicycle days, the couch stained with milk, the table where meat was often missing but affection was plenty. Now, all of it seemed distant, almost fictional. As if it had been lived by another woman. One who no longer existed. Brenda spent her afternoons tending the garden. Lavender, hydrangeas, and some stubborn rosebushes that resisted the dry soil. It was her way of keeping control, of placing beauty where life had left only pain. Caring for the plants gave her the illusion of reciprocity, something her children hadn't given her in a long time. They had moved on. Careers, marriages, social media filled with smiles that no longer included their mother. She watched it all from a distance, like someone watching a movie she had been cut from in the final edit. And still, she didn't block, didn't complain, didn't demand. Because a mother's love is like that: it gives, even when it doesn't return. 2 whole years had passed since the last word exchanged with Cassie. A thick silence, heavy with pride and unspoken grievances. Until one ordinary afternoon, the mailman left a lilac envelope in the mailbox. It was the invitation to her daughter's baby shower. Brenda recognized the name on the sender and her heart raced, as if finding a piece of herself again. She opened the envelope with trembling hands and tearful eyes. For a second, the world regained color. It was a simple invitation, but filled with unwritten promises. Maybe this was the beginning of reconciliation. Maybe Cassie was ready to reconnect. Maybe that treacherous word rekindled a hope Brenda had tried to forget. She sat at the kitchen table, holding the invitation as if it were a winning ticket. Her mind spun in 1,000 directions: what to wear, what to say, how to act. Should she go? What if she was rejected again? What if? But along with the doubt, something else emerged: a stubborn thread of hope, the kind that insists even when the heart says stop. Brenda reread the invitation like someone searching for a hidden line, a secret code. There was a "We hope to see you" there, handwritten maybe by her own daughter. That was enough for Brenda's most vulnerable side to want to believe. Because a mother, even scarred, never loses the desire to be wanted. In the nights that followed, she barely slept. Every corner of the house seemed more alive, as if the children's memories had also been awakened by the invitation. She pulled out old albums, re-watched VHS recordings digitized on her computer, and even found Mother's Day cards kept in a shoebox. Each memory was a double-edged sword: nostalgia and pain. But above all, they were her memories with her children, a time when love was simple and gratitude clearer. Even with the current denial of affection, that Brenda of the past still existed. And maybe, just maybe, she could be seen again. The next day, she went to town to buy a gift for the baby. She spent hours choosing. She wanted something special, that showed care without seeming desperate. She chose a set of embroidered blanket and handcrafted booties, delicate items, like the love she still held. Then she stopped at the salon, had her hair done, chose a new dress, and even wore perfume. She wanted to look good, not to impress, but to prove to herself there was still a woman there. A woman who feels, who takes care of herself, who chooses. Each detail was part of a silent ritual of rescue. Because Brenda wasn't just going to a baby shower, she was going in search of reconnection. And so, in that house in Deer Creek, where time seemed asleep, something different began to grow. It wasn't illusion. It was a subtle movement of inner reconciliation. Even with fear, Brenda wanted to try. Not for her daughter. For the woman she had become, Anne, who deserved more than emotional crumbs. The pain was still there, but now mixed with courage. And if you've ever been afraid to reopen a door that hurt you, you understand. Brenda was ready to try again, even without guarantees. Because sometimes, the simple act of going is already a gesture of independence. Brenda spent days with that invitation lying on the coffee table, as if the paper had a voice. Every time she passed by it, her heart leapt. Her mind, on the other hand, pulled the brake. You already know where this will end, she repeated to herself, like a mantra of self-preservation. But the paper was there, quiet, smiling with golden letters and subtle promises. It was just a baby shower. Was it an emotional trap? Because some invitations aren't just for events, they're disguised tests. And this one, without a doubt, was one of the biggest of Brenda's life. She knew she might leave there with a heart more wounded than before. But there was something that insisted. A stubbornness only the deeply rejected know. For 3 nights, she revisited imaginary dialogues with Cassie. She practiced smiles, rehearsed answers, thought of questions that might never come. What if she only invited me out of obligation? What if it's just to put me in a corner and save face? They were legitimate doubts, born of a painful history of ingratitude. Brenda had already been placed as a background character in her own daughter's life. She had already felt the silent humiliation of being ignored on special dates, of being remembered only when convenient. And now, with that invitation in hand, she stood before an emotional crossroads: protect herself or risk it. Hope was stubborn and sometimes cruel. Despite it all, she decided to go. But not just anyhow. She didn't want to look like a pitiful woman chasing after scraps. She wanted to show herself as dignified, whole, even in pieces inside. And it began with the gift. She went to a high-end children's boutique in the nearby city. She chose a hand-embroidered linen blanket, paired with a delicate set of baby booties and a memory book. It wasn't cheap. But Brenda wasn't there to save money. She wanted to leave a signature gesture of affection and worth, even without words. Because those who truly love don't know how to be mediocre, even when wounded. After the gift, she went to the beauty salon. She sat in the chair and asked for something simple, yet elegant. Wavy hair, light makeup, manicured nails. When she looked in the mirror, she saw something she hadn't seen in years: firmness. It wasn't beauty she sought, it was respect. And respect begins when you look at yourself with dignity. She chose a navy blue dress, discreet, but with perfect fit. And she wore the necklace her grandmother had given her, saved for special moments. She wanted to feel good. Not for Cassie, but for herself. After all, every detail of that preparation was, in truth, an inner stitching of invisible wounds life had left. On the day of the event, Brenda woke up early, made coffee, tidied the house, and sat on the porch with her cup in hand. She breathed deeply. She felt nervous, but determined. She didn't know what she would find, but she knew who she was. And that was enough. The car in the driveway was clean, the gift wrapped with care. Each gesture seemed small, but it was grand. Because going there was more than showing up, it was facing ghosts, defying humiliation, and saying with her gaze, "I am still here." There was fear, of course. But there was also a kind of silent courage, the kind only real women know. Before leaving, she put perfume on her wrists, as she used to in her youth. She looked in the mirror one last time and smiled faintly. Not the open smile of someone happy, but the smile of someone whole, even with cracks. The Brenda who left home that day was not the same who had received the invitation. She carried pain, yes, but also clarity. She would not beg for love, nor plead for attention. She was going for herself. For the woman who had raised children alone, endured contempt without fighting back, survived the small daily deaths of ungrateful motherhood. That trip to the baby shower wasn't reconciliation. It was resistance. During the drive, the road seemed longer than it was. Her head spun with old memories: Cassie's first tooth, the 15th birthday party, the fights over the boyfriend she didn't approve of. Each memory was a knot in her throat. But Brenda didn't cry. Because this was no longer the time for tears. It was the time for firmness. When she arrived at the vineyard, she stayed in the car for a few minutes. She observed the place from afar. She felt her heart pounding. Then she got out. Not in a rush, not hesitating, but with dignity. Hope was still stubborn, but now it walked hand in hand with self-respect. And if you've ever had to put on your best clothes to face your greatest pain, you understand Brenda. Sometimes life doesn't give us applause. It gives us tests. And it is in those moments we discover who we really are. What would come after that day, she still didn't know. But one thing was certain: there was no more room for naivety. Brenda chose to go, not because she believed in miracles, but because she deserved to be seen. And even if she wasn't, she knew at least one person at that event would be fully aware of the worth she carried. Herself. The vineyard was stunning, with rows of grapes swaying in the horizon as if dancing with the wind. A large white tent had been set up in the center, decorated with pink bows, golden balloons, and wildflower arrangements on every table. There was an exaggerated delicacy in everything, as if the event wanted to scream perfect family in every detail. Brenda arrived discreetly, parked far from the entrance, and walked toward the place with firm steps. She observed the guests, all young, well-dressed, smiling as if living in a bubble where nothing went wrong. It was like entering a movie she was no longer part of. A movie that, deep down, she had helped write but had been cut from in the final version. She walked to the gift table and placed her package carefully, as if it were an offering. Some curious glances turned to her, but quickly shifted away. There were no hugs, no long time no see, no so glad you came. Just silence and formality. When she saw Cassie, her heart skipped a beat. Her daughter looked radiant, belly showing under a light dress, flawless makeup, a wide smile for the guests. But that smile vanished the instant her eyes met her mother's. The glow disappeared. Cassie quickly turned to speak to someone else, as if Brenda were just another guest. That hurt more than any scream. Brenda tried to approach, but was interrupted by a distant acquaintance wanting small talk. While smiling politely, she watched her daughter moving among the tables, laughing, taking pictures with her mother-in-law and friends. No one introduced her. No one mentioned her. She sat at a corner table, far from the music and lively conversations, like a misplaced piece of a puzzle already redone without her. The humiliation was silent, but total. The humiliation was silent, but total. It was as if she had been invited only to fulfill a protocol, to avoid making it look like there had been a complete cut, though, in practice, she had been cut long ago. With each new group photo, each toast, each affectionate gesture between Cassie and Patricia, the mother-in-law, Brenda sank a little deeper. It was like watching a well-rehearsed play where she wasn't even an extra. Her eyes took in the details: the cake decorated with the child's name, the little cards with sweet phrases, the personalized keepsakes bearing the names of the future grandparents. Grandma Patricia, one of them red, embroidered on an apron. Brenda took a deep breath. This wasn't an event of celebration. It was a ritual of replacement. She was being erased there, in public, with pats on the back and courteous smiles. Rejection was served at the table. And she had to swallow it. Cassie passed by her twice. Once carrying a plate of sweets. Another, walking with her husband. In neither instance did she look directly at her. No kiss, no "I'm glad you came, Mom." Only the calculated coldness of someone who had already made an inner decision. Brenda wondered what she had done so unforgivable. Was it raising her alone? Failing while trying to succeed? Saying no when she had to? Maybe it was too much love, suffocating care, the demand for responsibility, but there, none of it seemed to matter. Her daughter was in another world. And she? She simply endured. As always. Time passed slowly. Brenda lifted her glass of juice only to keep her hands busy. She avoided eye contact. She tried to appear occupied watching the scenery, but inside, she was a storm. She saw people she didn't even know being called up for photos with Cassie. She heard effusive compliments to Patricia, now treated as the pillar of the new family. And she invisible. Even the waiters seemed more integrated into the party than she was. That afternoon wasn't about celebrating a new life. It was about burying an old relationship. And that became clearer with every passing minute. Brenda thought of leaving many times. But she didn't. because leaving would mean admitting defeat. And she no longer had the strength for new losses. Sitting in that corner, with her eyes glistening but refusing to let tears fall, she thought about everything she had done. The sleepless nights, the childbirths alone, the overdue bills, the clothes washed by hand, the birthdays planned with the little she had. All of it only to be ignored now. The betrayal wasn't in a single action, but in the slow and systematic construction of ingratitude. And there, in silence, she understood what hurt wasn't Cassie's contempt. It was the echo of everything she herself had allowed. And if you've ever been invited to a party where you weren't welcome, you know how deeply it marks you. Brenda went, with hope. But what she received was humiliation. She sat there, motionless, on the outside. But inside, something began to move. And this time, it was different. It wasn't sadness. It was a kind of cold clarity, as if her soul had pressed an emergency button. The world around her kept celebrating. But inside her, a silent decision was being sealed. A definitive break, with no return. Because even hope, when mistreated too long, grows tired. The sun was already lower when someone called for silence to make a toast. Cassie, elegant and holding a glass of champagne, climbed onto a small improvised stage between the tables. The music softened, cell phones were raised to record, and all eyes turned to her, living her star moment. Brenda, still seated in the corner, lifted her gaze with a flicker of hope. Maybe now, maybe a thank you, a mention. She knew she didn't need much. Just a word, a gesture, a look. But what came was something she would never forget. Cassie smiled and said, with a firm and clear voice, there is someone here who was everything to me. A woman who guided me, supported me, and taught me how I want to raise my child. For an instant, Brenda's heart raced. Could it be? But the name that followed wasn't hers. Patricia, my mother-in-law, you are more than family. You are the mother life gave me. The words landed like a punch. There was applause, emotional laughter. Patricia cried and embraced Cassie amid shouts of so sweet, so beautiful. Brenda heard nothing. Everything turned into a muffled buzz, as if she were underwater. She remained still, the glass still in her hand, while the crowd rose to celebrate the declaration. No one noticed the woman in the corner. No one looked at her. No one saw the invisible blood dripping from a heart breaking in silence. Cassie continued her speech as if Brenda didn't exist. She spoke of lessons, of emotional support, of advice that had brought her there. All attributed to her mother-in-law. And then came the final blow. That's why, to me, she is the true grandmother of my child. More applause followed. Photos. Kisses. A cheerful toast. Brenda smiled faintly. But it was the kind of smile only those who have already died inside can give. The humiliation was public, rehearsed, and applauded. There was no doubt anymore. This wasn't just neglect. It was a conscious choice of erasure. And to be erased by the one you brought into the world is one of the cruelest forms of betrayal. Little by little, people began to return to their conversations. But Brenda couldn't move. She seemed frozen, like an invisible statue in the middle of the celebration. That statement was more than rejection, it was an emotional execution. And she watched it all with eyes wide open, unable to react. It was as if she had been buried alive under the shadow of another woman. A woman who hadn't even been present in Cassie's early years. But now, she had the title, the recognition, the stage. And she, who had been behind every scene of Cassie's upbringing, was nothing more than a tolerated spectator. Not even named. No one went to her. No one commented on what had been said. The collective omission hurt as much as Cassie's words. It was as if everyone had agreed with that gesture, if the story Brenda had lived with her daughter had truly been erased. She looked at her glass of juice, now warm, and asked herself, how did I end up here? Where did I lose my daughter? The answer never came. But the pain was clear. There, in front of everyone, she hadn't just lost her daughter. She had lost herself. Her identity as a mother, her place in the story, her narrative. Everything had been stripped away with no chance to reply. Maybe the worst part of that scene wasn't what was said, but what was left unsaid. What no one did. The people who knew Brenda's journey and still ignored her. Cassie's friends, who grew up hearing stories of the hard-working mother. The relatives who knew who had held everything together in the darkest days. They all stayed silent. Ingratitude became a spectacle. And humiliation, a socially accepted performance. There, Brenda's memory was rewritten in real time. A new version of history was being told, and in it, she was no longer the protagonist. She was a background character. Or worse, the mistake everyone decided to forget. But within that silence, something was forming. A different force, cold and lethal. Because there comes a point when pain transforms into impulse. And that's exactly what happened. Brenda didn't get up. She didn't make a scene. But inside, a decision was already sealed. The woman who had sat there as a mother would stand as something else. No longer the emotional servant. No longer the unconditional foundation. Something had broken for good. Because even the most devoted mother has a limit. And in that moment, Brenda discovered hers. A limit that, once crossed, allows no return. And if you think justice comes with screams or scandals, maybe you need to know the strength of silent revenge. Brenda learned that sometimes, the greatest power is not reacting, not yet. Because silence can be the most powerful threat when paired with strategy. And in that instant, she stopped waiting. Now, she would write the story. And Cassie? She would have to deal with the consequences. Because what follows a cruel toast is a cold awakening. And that awakening would be relentless. The drive back to Deer Creek was silent. Brenda gripped the wheel firmly, her eyes fixed on the road. There were no tears. No music. Only the sound of the engine and a strange peace, almost uncomfortable. The pain was still there, of course, throbbing like an open wound. But alongside it came something new: clarity. A cold, calculating clarity, as if a new version of Brenda had taken the wheel of her own life. The woman who had left home full of hope never returned. In her place came someone who would no longer accept being invisible. And when she parked in the driveway, she knew this wasn't the end, it was point zero. The beginning of a new era. She walked into the house, removed her shoes, and went straight to the desk. She turned on the lamp, took a deep breath, and grabbed a sheet of paper. She began to write. It was a list: names, dates, passwords, accounts. Everything that could matter. Then she picked up the phone and made 2 calls. The first, to the trusted lawyer who had helped her in the divorce years ago. The second, to a private investigator recommended by an old friend. The voice on the other end sounded surprised, but Brenda was direct. She didn't want talk, she wanted action. She was assembling a plan. A dossier. A counterattack. But not for revenge, for poetic justice. The next day, she rented a small storage unit in a discreet part of town. There, she began taking old boxes and folders. Financial documents, transfer records, bank statements, receipts of loans she had made to her children, many never repaid. She separated each envelope with labels: Cassie, Michael, cards, messages. She also printed saved WhatsApp conversations, forgotten emails, screenshots of messages asking for help. All archived with precision. She wasn't just organizing memories, she was building evidence. A living archive of her own story, one no one else had the right to erase. Brenda also dug through the attic for old letters, contracts signed in her children's names, even handwritten notes that now carried new weight. The words "thank you, Mom" had vanished from real life, but here they were recorded, in the shaky handwriting of childhood and adolescence. It was like an internal trial. And she gathered everything with the patience of someone who knows her turn to speak is coming. Only this time, she wouldn't use her voice. She would use facts. Evidence. The past as a weapon and no longer as a burden. She built a thick binder with colored dividers, one for each type of relationship: emotional, financial, personal. Each tab told a part of the story Cassie and Michael pretended not to remember. And that was exactly what Brenda wanted, to prevent her memory being rewritten by those who had never lived her pain. The goal wasn't to expose them publicly. It was to hand back the mirror. To show, unfiltered, what they had done and what she had tolerated for far too long. Because even silence, when ignored, screams. And now, Brenda would be heard, even if with coldness. Along with the documents, she began recording short videos, giving objective accounts of specific situations. She spoke with clarity, without drama. On this date in this year, I did this for so-and-so. Result: silence. Gratitude: none. It was like leaving an emotional testament, but also a strategic one. A record that would serve both the present and the future. She didn't want pity, she wanted justice. And above all, she wanted to ensure that, in the end, the truth would be preserved even if no one spoke it out loud. Brenda told no one what she was doing. She carried on with her usual routine: gardening, coffee, walks. But inside, the movement was seismic. Her identity was being rebuilt piece by piece. And the more she organized her archive, the more she felt that the humiliation of the baby shower would not be the final chapter. She wouldn't scream, beg, or send desperate messages. She would respond with precision, with armed silence, with emotional and financial independence. Because the truest revenge, sometimes, is no longer needing anyone to validate your pain. And if you think planning your own liberation is extreme, maybe you've never been a prisoner of one-sided love. Brenda had. For decades. But no longer. And each document she stored was a brick in the wall she was building between past and present. A high, impenetrable wall, made not of bitterness but of decision. And those who thought she was just a fragile, forgotten woman would soon see the consequences of rejecting the one who had loved them most. Brenda didn't need to raise her voice. When she decided to act, she did so with the precision of someone underestimated her entire life. She prepared 2 identical packets, one addressed to Cassie and the other to Michael. Each envelope contained more than papers, they were bound truths. Receipts, bank statements, contracts signed in their names, proof of debts she had paid off for them. She even included statements of the car payments Michael claimed to have paid on his own, but which she had actually covered for 2 years without his knowing. Everything organized chronologically, with markers and explanatory notes. Nothing aggressive, everything neutral. But the weight of reality was devastating. On top of the documents, she placed a short letter for memory and clarification. With affection, Brenda. There were no accusations, only facts. Brenda knew the hardest blow is that of conscience. Once it awakens, you can never sleep in peace again. Cassie received her packet 3 days after the shower. She called, texted, tried to reach out. Brenda didn't answer. Michael, more impulsive, sent an angry voice message, calling her ungrateful and manipulative. The irony? He used the very same words she had once heard in silence. Now, she returned them with elegance. With no reply. No confrontation. Because Brenda's strength wasn't in shouting, but in the silence that exposes. She also included screenshots of conversation snippets where Cassie had said, "My mother doesn't know how to act in classy settings. Patricia has more elegance to be a grandmother." Even messages exchanged with James, her son-in-law, plotting to exclude Brenda from decisions about the baby. Brenda didn't want scandal. She wanted to show. To show that she had seen everything, read everything, understood everything. That she had known for a long time the role they had reserved for her, the shadow. And now, she refused that role. No scandal, no drama. Only the dignity of someone who finally realized love without respect is servitude. The tone of the letters, the documents, the evidence was surgical. There was no visible resentment, only facts. Brenda presented herself like someone delivering a report. And that was what destabilized her children the most. They expected tears, pleas, emotional blackmail. Instead, they received coldness, lucidity, and proof. For the first time, they had to look into the eyes of their own ingratitude. And there was no way to look away. Brenda showed she had known everything and yet had remained present. Until the day she was discarded. Now, no longer. Cassie, in shock, tried to control the damage. She called relatives, tried to justify, distort, paint her mother as resentful. But the documents spoke for themselves. Some family members, once distant, began to wonder if they had judged Brenda fairly. Because the public humiliation was recent but the history of exploitation stretched back far. Michael disappeared for a while, perhaps trying to erase his own shame. But the wound was made. With a simple gesture, Brenda dismantled the narrative built against her. And she did it without raising her voice once. Meanwhile, Brenda kept her routine. She tended her garden, read her books, drank tea on the porch. It was as if nothing had changed and yet everything had. Inside, a new kind of peace was settling. A peace not born of reconciliation, but of justice. She knew her children were processing the blow. And deep down, maybe they expected a move from her. A retreat. A let's talk. But it would never come. Because now, she was the one setting the pace. And the time of submission was over. That was the first time Brenda stood her ground not with screams or tears, but with consequence. She didn't vent, she revealed. She didn't accuse, she showed. And that made all the difference. Because the strength of a woman despised for decades reveals itself when she stops asking and starts acting. There was no revenge in the classic sense. There was a course correction. A necessary rupture. And unlike all the others, this one came with documents. With date, time, and proof. And if you think truth always comes with time, know this: sometimes it must be laid bare. Brenda had no fear of exposing the ingratitude she received. Because those who have lived in the shadow of disdain have nothing left to lose. And she, at that point, had only one thing on her mind: she would never again let anyone manipulate the story of the woman she was. The answer had been given. Now, it was up to her children to taste the bitter flavor of their own choices. Brenda began to sift through her archives with new eyes. The boxes in the attic were no longer just deposits of the past, but rooms of emotional record. With ceremonial care, she pulled out photo albums and decided it was time to rewrite the story. She replaced her name, where it had been erased or omitted, with Patricia, right there as a mark. In photos of parties, birthdays, Christmases, she corrected captions and notes. Not to lie, but to reclaim a presence denied for so many years. Each correction was a symbolic act that, though they had tried to erase her, she reaffirmed her place in memory and in the world of those who might still remember or rediscover her truth. In future family gatherings, those photos would be seen by curious eyes. But the change wasn't just aesthetic, it was a stand. She knew rewritten memory sometimes begins with images. The photos, those sentimental relics, now told who she really was: the mother who had been there, even while invisible. By putting Patricia there, she rewrote the narrative. It was poetic justice, disguised in simplicity. A silent and powerful revenge. And more than that, a sign that the story could be revisited even by those who claimed to remember but chose to ignore. Of course, when Cassie and Michael saw these alterations, they noticed immediately. Digital copies in emails, physical albums with new captions, it left them speechless. Cassie was the first to question, her voice shaking. Michael, embarrassed, tried to excuse it as an art project or a mix-up with the files. But Brenda stood firm. With patience and crystalline clarity, she explained that she had only restored her name where it had always belonged. She didn't apologize. But she didn't attack either. She simply gave back what was already hers: honor, presence, identity. In this silent dialogue, Brenda drew clear boundaries. She said, gently, that she would no longer be the emotional servant fixing others' mistakes, nor the quiet financier of her children's choices. That now she would take care of her own life, not the narrative others preferred to tell. And that worked like a barrier. The silence that once was emptiness was now protection. Her children felt it: there was an invisible line they had never dared cross, and now it stood there, impenetrable. And the freshness of her liberation cut deeper than any scream. She carried on with her life, but with expanded presence. She knew that rewritten memory worked as a mirror of reality. It showed that what was forgotten could still exist, if someone had the courage. With each record, each adjusted caption, she reclaimed a piece of dignity. And if, in the future, someone remembered with affection, they would remember the version she had chosen to rescue, not the one others tried to impose. Each photo was a silent reminder that those who love demand respect, and so do memories. Those albums would never be the same again. Gradually, new signals appeared. Friends called to comment on the beauty of the photos. Who started this? They asked. Brenda replied calmly, it was only justice. The inner peace she felt was genuine. There was no resentment, only clarity. She had set real, emotional, and symbolic boundaries. She was no longer emotionally moldable by promises or guilt. That visual rewriting was also a silent warning that certain wounds had healed even if some scars persisted as marks of resilience. And more than rewriting, she offered a choice. Anyone who wanted to remain in her life would have to respect her whole existence, not just when convenient. Cassie and Michael found themselves faced with a reflection they couldn't change, and which, finally, valued the one who had been there from the beginning. That clarity, that firmness, was a path to rebuilding if they wanted to take it. But it was no longer her responsibility. It was, finally, freedom. A woman who had chosen to be valued, with subtlety and authority. Brenda began the process of disconnection methodically, almost like an emotional surgery. She changed her phone number, deleted the contacts she had once kept out of politeness, and closed the social media accounts where her pain was renewed daily through photos and posts from children who ignored her masterfully. It was liberating. For the first time in years, she no longer lived in the expectation of a message, a notification, a Facebook memory. The peace that had begun with silence now expanded as relief. It was like leaving a stifling room and breathing deeply outdoors. Their absence no longer hurt. On the contrary, it brought lightness. She also changed her daily habits. Mornings, once steeped in coffee and sadness, now began with walks in the open air. Brenda volunteered at a non-profit that supported abandoned women. Ironically, it was there she felt most embraced. Women with stories worse than hers, but with the same common thread: rupture as cure. They laughed, shared recipes, cried quietly, and helped each other. For the first time, Brenda felt seen, not as a mother, not as a provider, but as a woman. A whole woman, who could be heard and respected without having to give away her last piece of self. Gardening also regained its place of honor in her routine. The hydrangeas bloomed like never before. Lavender grew strong, and the smell of damp earth became one of her daily joys. It was as if, by pruning plants, she was pruning bad memories too. What doesn't bloom, we don't water anymore, she told herself with a slight smile. The garden, once a symbol of waiting for her children's return, was now hers alone. There were no extra chairs or cups set aside for visits that never came. The house was finally a home for one. And that was enough. Brenda began welcoming new friendships, people who knew her for who she was now, not for the image of the sacrificial mother so many had used until they tired of her. The conversations took on a new tone. No one asked anymore, "And your kids?" People wanted to know about her favorite books, her movies, her weekend plans. Simple things, but full of dignity. Small moments of true exchange. She rediscovered the joy of talking without hidden agendas, of laughing until breathless, of allowing herself to fail, forget, begin again. Brenda, who for so long had been just a role, was now a person. And the most surprising part? There was no regret. None. The absence of her children was no longer an open wound, but a scar that told a story without pain. Brenda no longer missed the emotional manipulation, the veiled demands, the punishing silences. All of it now felt as distant as a bad dream forgotten upon waking. And awake she was. She wished no one harm, but neither did she wish for the presence of those who had treated her as disposable. It was complete liberation, the liberation of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. And above all, no longer needed to beg for respect. She began reading more, listening to music, going to the movies alone, taking creative writing courses. A new world opened. It wasn't about starting life over, it was about finally living. Brenda no longer tried to fit into spaces that rejected her. She created her own spaces, her own rituals of joy. Her inner peace was the most powerful answer she could give to the contempt she had endured. And that peace was not fragile. It was shielded. Because it had been built brick by brick, after each fall, each disappointment, each sleepless night that no longer mattered. And to outsiders, it might have seemed she was alone. But only Brenda knew how much that solitude was chosen, not imposed. Being alone was no longer a synonym for abandonment. It became a synonym for autonomy. She was no longer the woman waiting at the gate, waiting for messages on her phone, waiting for last-minute invitations. Now she was the one deciding when, how, and with whom to share her time. And that power, even silent, was liberating. Because there is no chain harder to break than expectation. And Brenda no longer expected anything from anyone. And if you've ever felt suffocated trying to hold on to relationships that only drained you, maybe it's time to do as Brenda did: close the door firmly and open the windows for yourself. Liberation, sometimes, doesn't come with applause. It comes with a sigh of relief, with a calm morning, with the certainty that you are enough. Brenda never went back. Because when peace arrives, you understand those who truly love you don't force you to bleed to prove it. The phone rang when Brenda least expected it. It was James, her son-in-law. His voice was low, almost embarrassed. The baby had been born. Cassie was fragile. "I think it's time for you to meet your grandson," he said. Brenda listened in silence. Her heart didn't race. No tears. No hesitation. The answer was clear, serene, definitive: "When he grows up and wants to meet me on his own, he'll be here. Until then, no." James insisted, mentioned family, begged for a chance. But she had already given all of them. And now, her absence was protection, not punishment. It was the silent cry of a woman who had chosen not to bleed anymore to prove love. Brenda carried on with her life in peace. The garden bloomed. The nights were calm. There was no longing, only gratitude for having freed herself. Meanwhile, Cassie faced the weight of her own ingratitude: a broken marriage, debts piling up, loneliness. Michael tried to reach out, asked for help. But Brenda didn't yield. Not out of revenge but out of self-respect. She no longer saved anyone. Each silence of hers was an answer. Each absence, a boundary. In the end, her children learned the hardest way that love without respect is only servitude. And she would serve no more. Her legacy was this: not shouting, not begging. Simply living with the dignity of someone who survived abandonment and chose never again to abandon herself. Brenda had spent her life giving everything. She endured disdain, stayed silent before ingratitude, insisted where there was only silence. But everything changed the day she was humiliated publicly by her own daughter. What seemed like the final blow was, in truth, the awakening. The woman who had always served decided, at last, to serve herself with respect, with justice, with peace. She rewrote memories, broke patterns, and sealed her freedom with firmness. She didn't scream. She didn't explain. She simply turned her back and moved on. On the other side came the consequences. Cassie faced the abandonment she had once inflicted. Michael discovered the mother who had always rescued him no longer answered. And Brenda? She carried on in peace. Without remorse, without regret. She understood that love without respect is only a cycle of pain, and she no longer turned that wheel. Her absence was the answer. Her calm was the cut. And her new life, the greatest example that those who love themselves no longer beg for space. If this story touched you, if you have ever felt you gave too much and received too little, subscribe to the channel, share your reflection, and turn on notifications. Here you will find stories that heal, awaken, and set you free. In the end, Brenda didn't teach with speeches. She taught with action. She showed that you don't need revenge when you have clarity. And that inner peace is the greatest gift anyone can achieve. Let this story remind you don't need permission to put yourself first. Only courage.